Back in 2024, the Hispanic and Independent vote was the absolute engine of the incumbent coalition. But fast forward to mid-2026, and well, that engine hasn't just stalled out, it has completely shifted into reverse. We're looking at a political landscape experiencing a profound correction right now, and it's being driven by a massive disconnect between foreign policy and the kitchen table. The administration is framing recent overseas interventions as tactical triumphs, but the data tells a vastly different story about how these exact events are echoing through the American electorate.
When we actually dig into the data behind this shift, it's wild. We're tracking a generic congressional ballot that has rapidly, almost violently, expanded into a massive 10-point margin favoring the opposition. Now, historically, sure, the party in power expects a natural midterm dip, right? But a 10-point deficit? That isn't a standard correction. That is a full-on structural realignment. Think of this data like a weather report, an objective measurement of a voting public that is fundamentally recalculating its priorities, literally in real time.
To get the most granular view of this realignment, we just have to look at the April 2026 Emerson College survey. They took a meticulously matched sample of 1,000 likely voters, giving us a tight 3% margin of error, and it captured a definitive 50 to 40% split. And because these responses were rigorously filtered for likely voters, it strips away all that background noise. It gives us a brutally accurate read on the enthusiasm gap that is forming right now on the ground.
The hard numbers show a deep structural erosion among core demographics. We're talking a massive 35-point margin shift among Hispanic voters and a 19-point shift among independents breaking left. Just 2 years ago, these were the exact groups that cemented the electoral map. Now, a near-total reversal is underway. This isn't just some subtle gradual drift. It's an abrupt correction, driven heavily by communities who are feeling the absolute brunt of recent economic fallout from executive decisions.
And this polling reversal didn't just happen out of nowhere. It's the mathematical result of a direct causal chain, basically a crisis-to-poll pipeline. Let's trace it back. In January, Operation Absolute Resolve launched in Venezuela. In February, a major military conflict kicked off in Iran. By March, this triggered a massive 10.9% spike in energy prices. And so, by May, boom, we arrive at a 10-point deficit on the generic ballot. It's a flawless transmission of international shocks, turning right into domestic shifts.
Look at how this started. The January capture of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and the February strikes in Iran were definitely marketed as rapid, decisive tactical triumphs, but the reality on the ground has been so much more complex. These actions led to the revocation of temporary protected refugee status for hundreds of thousands of people, all while the overseas conflict bogged down into a really costly military stalemate. What started out as this display of hard power abroad rapidly morphed into a prolonged, grinding logistical and humanitarian challenge.
The real kicker here was the resulting closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That totally scrambled global trade, and it acted as the primary catalyst transmitting this overseas stalemate straight to the American consumer. You simply cannot cut off one of the world's most critical shipping arteries without sending immediate shockwaves through the entire global supply chain. For the everyday citizen, this geopolitical friction isn't just some abstract debate happening in Washington. It is a very tangible, very painful hurdle right there at the checkout counter. That friction ignited an unbelievable 10.9% monthly spike in energy prices by March. That is the highest single-month increase we've seen in over 2 decades. In fact, inflation acceleration effectively tripled between February and March alone. Against numbers that stark, any narrative claiming this is just fake inflation totally falls apart under the weight of the empirical data.
So the executive branch's focus on hard power abroad is now colliding head-on with the kitchen table reality of $4.39 gasoline. Because of this conflict, American households have been forced to absorb an extra $16 billion in excess fuel spending. Diesel and jet fuel costs have surged, and that just cascades right into higher prices for groceries and basic consumer goods. Simply put, this global strategy is pricing out the average family.
With 39% of households flat out saying they feel financially worse off, these data points confirm something really critical. For the average voter, international conflict is now being evaluated primarily as a domestic pocketbook issue. Voters are feeling a daily drain on their bank accounts. They are directly connecting the dots between foreign military operations and the rising cost of just driving to work, and they're bringing that exact financial anxiety directly into the voting booth.
Which brings us to independent voters. These are our stability-seeking data points, and they are expressing a lot of quiet frustration right now. The numbers are striking. 64% disapprove of the current economic environment, and 61% disapprove of the current foreign policy. These folks aren't partisan activists. They're moving away from the incumbent party not out of sheer ideology, but out of a deep, fundamental desire for a return to domestic equilibrium. They just want stability, and the data clearly shows they feel they've lost it.
And this exhaustion, it's compounded by a historic across-the-board decay in institutional trust. We're talking an astonishing 80% of the public lacking confidence in Congress, alongside 62% for the Supreme Court and 61% for the presidency. That reflects a deep, systemic cynicism toward all governing bodies. The 2026 electorate isn't necessarily falling in love with the opposition. Actually, it's much more of a pox on both your houses sentiment, where the party currently holding the levers of power just naturally bears the heaviest blame for the dysfunction.
But wait, because here is where the story gets really complicated. While the national mood clearly indicates a profound shift, the actual electoral outcome is constrained by a hidden mathematical buffer. There is a structural counterweight driven by mid-decade redistricting. This is the hidden math of it all. A massive wave of voter enthusiasm is hurtling forward, but it's about to crash right into a seawall of carefully reconstructed electoral maps.
This all goes back to the Supreme Court's landmark Louisiana v. Collis ruling in April 2026, which significantly narrowed the legal framework for evaluating racial gerrymandering. The court basically ruled that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is violated only when there is a strong inference of intentional discrimination rather than just a discriminatory effect. In simple terms, it means maps are now much harder to strike down unless you can definitively prove the mapmaker specifically intended to discriminate. It's a subtle but profoundly impactful legal distinction that has triggered a massive cascade of map revisions.
That judicial precedent totally emboldens state legislatures across the South to implement new maps. We've seen redraws in Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, and Florida, and together they're generating a very real redistricting deficit. Analysts are projecting these new maps could insulate the incumbent party with up to 8 additional House seats. So we're looking at a structural headwind that was meticulously designed to neutralize the shifting national mood we just talked about.
So we are left with this stark, unavoidable tension between the popular will and the structural reality. Because of this redistricting deficit, a massive national popular vote lead might be required simply to negate the systemic map advantages. Think about that for a second. The opposition doesn't just need to win the popular vote. They need to win it by a significantly larger margin just to reach a baseline, bare minimum legislative majority.
Adding even more fuel to this structural fire is an impending clash at the Federal Reserve. The institution is staring down a 4-decade-high stagflation dilemma. On one side, rising war-related energy prices are screaming for higher interest rates to curb inflation, but on the other side, a weakening job market is demanding rate cuts to prevent a full-blown recession. It's an incredibly high-stakes economic tightrope walk playing out exactly when voters are demanding some kind of relief.
And timing is everything, right? Chairman Powell's term is expiring right amid immense executive pressure for lower interest rates. This resulting institutional friction ensures that market volatility is going to persist. Based on these compounding stagflation cycles, this institutional clash at the Fed is going to keep the economic anxiety index remarkably high all the way through November. The financial uncertainty is absolutely locked in as a permanent fixture of the 2026 electorate.
When we extrapolate these dual forces, the economic volatility on one hand and the structural map rigidity on the other, it points us directly toward the Senate map. And here, the opposition faces an incredibly steep uphill battle. To actually capitalize on this national polling surge, they have to compete in deep red states like Ohio, Iowa, Texas, and Florida. These are territories that overwhelmingly favored the incumbent by double digits back in 2024. So yes, the national environment is definitely shifting, but the state-by-state geography, it remains deeply, stubbornly entrenched.
If we look at historical precedent and run the current statistical models, they heavily indicate one very specific trajectory. When you combine a sweeping national mood against the incumbent with a highly fortified, structurally entrenched electoral map, the math reliably leads to a divided government in 2027. It's a scenario where overwhelming popular momentum gets completely diffused by state-level geography, ultimately resulting in legislative gridlock.
Which brings us to the defining, really unresolved tension of the entire 2026 cycle. A 10-point lead in the national popular vote is colliding head-on with a map drawn to insulate the incumbent party. It forces us to ask a profound question about the very mechanics of our system. In a modern democracy, which should ultimately carry more weight? The national popular will of the voters or the constitutional authority of states to draw their own maps?
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.